In 1998, the most sophisticated trading operation in the history of financial markets collapsed in 90 days. The people running it were not gamblers. They were not reckless. Two of them had just won the Nobel Prize in economics. Their models were considered, by serious, credentialed people, to be nearly infallible. They had mapped risk down to fractions of fractions. They had stress tested against every scenario the markets had produced in living memory. They lost $4 billion. The Federal Reserve organized a private rescue operation to prevent the collapse from taking down the global financial system with it. The fund was called Long-Term Capital Management, and the lesson most people took from that story: that markets are unpredictable, that risk is real, that even the best models fail, was almost exactly the wrong lesson. Hi, I'm Buck, and today we're going to rethink how money really works. If you've ever felt like you were doing everything right and still falling behind, you're exactly where this conversation is meant to find you. Because here is the actual lesson of long-term capital management. Intelligence does not protect you from financial ruin. In some cases, it accelerates it. The Nobel laureates didn't fail because their math was wrong. Their math was extraordinary. They failed because they were so confident in their models that they borrowed $40 for every $1 they actually had. They failed because being right 99 times made it unthinkable that they could be wrong on the 100th. They failed because brilliant people are just as capable of blind spots as anyone else. Except brilliant people build elaborate, airtight justifications for theirs. Morgan Housel opens his book, The Psychology of Money, with a version of this observation. Financial outcomes, he argues, are not strongly correlated with IQ. They are not the reward for the most rigorous analysis. They are almost entirely the product of behavior. And behavior is shaped by things that have nothing to do with intelligence. Things like fear, like identity, like what the people around you are doing with their money and what that quietly pressures you to do with yours. This is a genuinely unsettling idea if you sit with it long enough. We have built an entire financial industry on the premise that better information produces better outcomes. But information isn't the bottleneck. We have never had more information. The bottleneck is always the person interpreting it, always the person deciding whether to act, hold, sell, or panic, and doing so in a moment charged with emotion they may not even fully recognize as emotion. The fund managers at Long-Term Capital Management were not emotional. They were ice cold, technically speaking. And yet the decisions they made were driven by something that looks, in retrospect, a great deal like hubris, like the human need to believe that the system you've built is more complete than it is. That's where we're starting today, and it's going to change how you see almost every financial decision you've made. To raise a distinction I want you to carry through the rest of this conversation. Rich, wealthy. Most people use these words interchangeably. They describe completely different things. Being rich is a current income event. It means money is coming in at a rate that allows for a certain visible way of living. Rich is legible. You can see it in the car, the house, the restaurants, the wardrobe. Rich is, more often than we acknowledge, something that gets performed. And it is entirely possible to perform being rich while the underlying financial picture is fragile in ways that would surprise you. Wealth is something else entirely. Wealth is not what you earn. It is what you don't spend. It is the accumulated gap between income and expenditure, stored somewhere and quietly compounding. Wealth has no visual signature. You cannot look at a person and identify them as wealthy, which means, and this is the part that matters, every signal we use to evaluate other people's financial success is actually measuring something different than what we think we're measuring. We see someone driving an expensive car and we file it under wealth, but that car could be leased or financed at a rate that quietly works against everything else in that person's financial life. We see someone in a large house and think, they've made it, but a large mortgage is not wealth. It is, technically, the opposite of wealth. It is a liability dressed up to look like an asset. Housel writes about this with a line I've returned to many times. He points out that wealth is created by suppressing what you could buy today, and that this makes it invisible, uninstagrammable, and nearly impossible to imitate, because you never see it being done. Nobody posts the thing they didn't buy. Nobody celebrates the account they didn't touch. This is why the people who look the richest are often not the wealthiest, and why the wealthiest people in any room are frequently the ones you wouldn't guess. The question worth asking is not, how much does this person earn? The question is, how much of what they earn do they keep? Because those two numbers can live very far apart, and only one of them builds a future. Now, I want to introduce an idea that sounds simple and turns out to be one of the most psychologically difficult things a person can do with money. it is called enough. Not as in barely enough, not as in settling. Enough as in, I have defined consciously what level of financial comfort actually satisfies me, and I have made a decision not to let that number keep moving. This sounds obvious. It is almost never practiced. Here is what gets in the way. Human beings are not very good at wanting what they have. We are extraordinarily good at wanting what we don't. And the moment we achieve something we wanted, the wanting tends to migrate to the next threshold, the next number, the next level. We don't notice this happening because it feels, from the inside, like legitimate ambition. It feels like growth. It is, in fact, a treadmill, and the person running on it is usually moving too fast to realize the scenery isn't changing. The philosopher's trap in personal finance is this: if you don't know what you're building toward, you will never arrive. You will accumulate and upgrade and expand indefinitely. And the security that was supposed to come with the money will keep receding just out of reach, no matter how close you get. Enough requires a different kind of thinking. It requires asking not what do I want next, but what does financial safety actually feel like for me in specifics, and how much does it actually cost? Most people have never done this calculation honestly. They have a vague sense that more would be better. They don't have a number, and without a number, every decision is made in the dark. The people who build lasting wealth, not loud wealth, lasting wealth, tend to have a clarity about this that most people lack. They know what the money is for. They know what they're protecting. And because they know, they don't keep reaching past it into risk they don't need to take. Rajat Gupta is a name worth knowing in this context. He was one of the most successful business executives in the world, former director of Goldman Sachs, former head of McKinsey. By almost any standard imaginable, he had enough. Generational wealth, global influence, a career that most people couldn't dream their way into. And yet, allegedly in pursuit of more, he passed insider information that eventually led to a federal conviction and a prison sentence. What he had was not enough, not for him, not then. The number kept moving, the way numbers do when they've never been anchored to anything real, to raise a second cost in the absence of enough, and it's rarely discussed. It is not just financial. It is the cost paid in anxiety, in the hours spent managing a lifestyle that has grown beyond what it needs to be, in the relationships strained by financial pressure that nobody admits to, in the work continued long past when it was necessary, because the number was never fixed. So the finish line was never reached. That cost doesn't appear on any statement, but it is paid in full by the person carrying it. This is where the story changes direction. Because if behavior is the dominant variable, if what separates financial outcomes is not intelligence but psychology, then we need to understand what is actually driving the psychology. And the answer is more uncomfortable than most financial content is willing to go. You make financial decisions based on your personal history with money, not the history of the market, yours. If you grew up in a household where money was scarce and unpredictable, you may carry an anxiety about spending that persists even after the scarcity is long gone. You might hoard cash in a savings account earning almost nothing, because the feeling of visible, accessible money is the only thing that quiets the old fear. This looks, from the outside, like poor investment strategy. From the inside, it is pure, rational self-protection, just against a threat that no longer exists. Conversely, if you grew up watching adults treat money as something that reliably appeared and reliably expanded, you might carry an optimism about financial risk that the data doesn't fully support. You take on leverage because the gut says it'll work out. The gut learned this from watching adults for whom it did work out in an era or a market that may have been unusually forgiving. Housel makes a point that is quietly one of the most important in the book. He says that no amount of studying financial history is a substitute for living through it. The person who watched the 2008 financial crisis from the outside, reading about it, has a fundamentally different relationship to risk than the person who watched their retirement account lose 40% of its value in 9 months and had to decide, in that moment, whether to sell or hold. Those are not equivalent experiences, and the decision that comes out of the second one is shaped by something information alone cannot replicate. This is why financial advice, as a genre, so often falls short. It treats everyone as though they are making decisions from the same psychological starting point. They are not. The rational choice for one person, given their history, their fears, their life stage, their specific version of enough, may be completely wrong for another. There is no universal correct answer. There are only answers that fit who you actually are, and the prerequisite to finding those answers is understanding yourself with a honesty that most financial planning tools don't ask for. Here is what that understanding actually looks like in practice. It means asking, what does money mean to me? Not as a concept, but as a feeling. Does having it make me feel safe? Does spending it make me feel alive? Does watching others have more of it make me feel behind? These are not small questions. They are the questions whose answers are quietly running every financial decision you make, not your spreadsheet, not your financial advisor. Those answers, understanding them doesn't make you immune to bad decisions. It makes you a witness to them in time to sometimes choose differently. Let's talk about something nobody wants to credit: luck. Not as an excuse, as an honest accounting. Every success story contains, somewhere inside it, a variable the person didn't control: the timing of their birth, the country they were born into, the decade their industry happened to expand, the mentor who noticed them, the market condition that turned a reasonable bet into a spectacular one. This does not diminish what people did with those circumstances. Ronald Read, a janitor and gas station attendant, who spent decades quietly buying and holding shares in solid companies, never touching the money, never panicking during downturns, driving a used car held together with safety pins, died with $11 million. He made real decisions. He exercised real discipline. And he also happened to live through one of the longest economic expansions in American history. Both things are true simultaneously. Neither one cancels the other out. The reason luck matters to talk about is not to make anyone feel better about failing. It is to make successful people more honest about the conditions that made success possible. And more specifically, to prevent the cognitive error of assuming that what worked in one set of conditions will work in all conditions going forward. Risk works in the other direction. When we see someone who made a reasonable financial decision that went badly, the person who bought property at exactly the wrong moment, the person who held a job in an industry that quietly evaporated, we tend to reach for character explanations. They were reckless. They should have seen it coming. They didn't try hard enough. But most financial catastrophes are not the result of stupidity. They are the result of reasonable decisions made under genuine uncertainty, with the information that was actually available at the time. She didn't make a bad decision. She made a reasonable decision with incomplete information. That's almost always how it goes. The appropriate response to this is not to stop making decisions. It is to hold them with a little more humility, to build room into your financial life for the fact that the unexpected is not the exception. It is simply the part of the plan that hasn't arrived yet. Room for error is one of the most underrated ideas in personal finance. Not emergency fund as a checkbox on a financial planning template. Room for error as a philosophy, as the structural acknowledgement that your models, however good they are approximations of reality, and reality at some point will exceed the approximation. This means keeping more cash than feels strictly necessary. It means not optimizing every dollar to its theoretically highest return. It means being willing to look slightly inefficient to someone who believes they can see the future with precision. Here is the paradox. The people who build the most room for error often look, in the short term, like they are being too conservative, leaving money on the table, not maximizing, but they are doing something more valuable. They are preserving their ability to stay in the game. Long-term capital management was not a room for error operation. It was a maximum optimization operation. Every dollar working at maximum leverage, every scenario stress tested against the past. And the one thing they didn't build in was the possibility that they might be wrong in a way history hadn't yet shown them. That gap between the model and the reality it was trying to capture was where $4 billion disappeared. The person who can stay invested through a 30% market decline without panic, selling without needing the money, without the kind of sleeplessness that produces irrational decisions at 3 a.m, will almost certainly outperform the person who was theoretically better at picking stocks but couldn't weather the volatility emotionally. Staying in the game is the strategy, not the prerequisite to the strategy. The strategy itself. And the quieter truth beneath that, compounding does not reward the smartest. It rewards the most patient. A portfolio that grows at a modest rate, left completely undisturbed, will eventually produce outcomes that dwarf a more aggressive portfolio interrupted by fear, by withdrawal, by the reactive decisions that market turbulence tends to produce in people who haven't built their financial lives with enough slack to absorb it. Time is the one variable in this equation that cannot be manufactured. It can only be protected. Teresa's a final layer here, and it ties everything together in a way most financial conversations never quite reach. We talked about behavior, about the gap between looking wealthy and being wealthy, about luck, about enough, about room for error. But underneath all of it is something more fundamental, something the Nobel laureates at long-term capital management had in extraordinary abundance in Ronald Read. The janitor understood without ever articulating. What is the money actually for? Not in the abstract, not security or freedom. Those are gestures toward an answer, not the answer itself. What does security mean in the daily texture of your actual life? What would freedom look like? Specifically, in the way your weeks were structured, the work you chose, the way you moved through a Wednesday afternoon. The people who build lasting wealth are almost never the ones who wanted the money most intensely. They tend to be the ones who are clearest about what the money was meant to do. The money was not the destination. The money was the mechanism. And knowing what the mechanism is supposed to produce changes every decision that feeds into it. It changes how you think about spending, not as deprivation versus reward, but as a question of whether this purchase moves you toward the life you've actually described or quietly away from it. It changes how you think about risk, not as exciting or terrifying, but as something to calibrate against how much optionality you actually need and can afford to lose. It changes how you think about time, which is the one resource in this equation you cannot earn more of, negotiate for, or recover once it has been spent. Ronald Read drove his used car for decades. He never gave interviews. He never explained himself. Nobody knew what he had until it was distributed after his death to the hospital and the library that now carries his name. But something in the structure of his financial life tells a clear story. He had made peace, at some point, with what he needed. The perception didn't matter. The signal didn't matter. The number on the account was not a trophy. It was simply the compound result of a life lived without financial noise, without debt, without performance, without the constant friction of wanting a next thing head, never clearly defined. That is a form of intelligence, not the Nobel Prize kind, the kind that compounds silently for 60 years and then surprises everyone. Many of these ideas come from The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel, a book that reminds us that wealth is rarely about how much you know, but how you behave. If this conversation stirred something in you, it is worth reading, not because it will hand you a better stock picking strategy, because it will show you yourself the part of you making financial decisions shaped by history and fear and social pressure you haven't fully named yet. Seeing that part clearly is where every real financial change begins. The goal was never the number. The goal was always what the number was supposed to make possible. If something in this shifted how you see your own decisions, stay with me, because next we're going to look at something that builds directly on this, a faster framework for understanding the handful of money principles that actually account for almost everything, not the textbook version, the real one. And why most people never find them is not what you think.